Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Overcoming Graduation with Brian Drury, a show where I work to teach you everything I wished I'd known about habits and mindset to help you begin creating your dream life today. Today is part one of an incredible interview with my buddy, Kirk Nurmi. And as I've gotten to know Kirk over the past couple years, the lessons that he has from the challenges he's faced are just incredible. And the perspective he has on life is one that I think is truly unique and one we can all benefit from hearing. So as a young man, Kirk had a fascination with law and knew that when he grew up, he wanted to be a lawyer. After facing multiple rejections from law school, he had a choice. He could give up his dream and stay working at the supermarket, or he could take the necessary steps and try again. Eventually, he made his dream become a reality and was a practicing defense attorney, and he believes that every person is entitled to have the best possible defense. His most notable case was when he was tasked to defend Jodi Arias, one of the most highly visible court cases of all time. He tells us about this time in his life, being on TV virtually 24/7, receiving hate mail, and he was even getting death threats to his wife. He talks about how he was able to make it through the toughest times during this trial, because that's something I think few of us, that type of visibility and attention is something few of us can even imagine. A time finally came when he decided to step away from law, but life threw another, even greater challenge his way. And this time it was a battle with cancer. Kirk took on that challenge as well and was able to ultimately beat cancer. And now through his books, his speaking, his one-man show, and interviews like this, he's working to help spread peace, love, and to help the world live with what he calls joyful urgency. In part one of this two-part interview series, Kirk will discuss how he overcame being rejected by law schools to ultimately achieve his goals, the main lessons he learned from his career in law and all his time in all his defense cases, how he managed to handle the stress and pressure from defending Jodi Arias in one of the most infamous trials of all time, why it is important to confront ourselves with questions at key moments in our lives. And I love that word, confront ourselves. That portion of the interview was something that has really stuck with me. Why Kirk has decided to use happiness as a beacon and how you can too, what it means to live with joyful urgency and why every person should adopt this mindset, and so much more. So guys, Kirk is a great friend of mine. He's someone that I've really just loved getting to know personally, and I love being able to share the incredible people I meet in my life with you guys through this show. So without any further ado, please allow me to introduce you to Kirk Nurmi. Kirk, welcome to the show, my brother.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks for having me.
It is great to have you, dude. I know we've been talking about doing this for months. And for all the listeners out there, Kirk and I spent a year together working on our speaking and working on our craft of speaking with Sean Stevenson. And we've gotten to know each other really well. And Kirk is one of my new favorite people. He is someone who has such an incredible story. And what he's doing now to impact the world is something that's truly special and inspiring. So, Kirk, I am thrilled and excited to dive into your story. And as we typically do on this show, I would love to kick off with where you were at the end of undergrad graduation, what your life looked like, and what your first step out into the quote-unquote real world looked like.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for the kind words. I appreciate that. When I graduated with my bachelor's degree, the real goal of even earning that degree was to get into law school. I had quit my job, kind of quit my youthful lifestyle, so to speak, gone back to school, moved in with my grandparents, and just focused all on getting that bachelor's degree with the aim of getting into law school. So the bachelor's degree in and of itself wasn't the end game, and the end game was law school.
Mm-hmm. And so you knew, and this is an interesting thing because there's always a spectrum. There's a spectrum of people where there are some who knew exactly what they wanted to do. They wanted to be a doctor or a lawyer. They had a specific career field in mind, and others who didn't. So as you knew you wanted to be a lawyer, and getting into law school can be a huge challenge by itself. So what was the process like applying, and what were the results as you started applying to and receiving responses back from law schools?
Sure. Well, back then, this was in the days before the internet. Some of your listeners might recommend those days. And you kind of had to research the various schools out of a manual. Where you wanted to apply, you had to take a law school admissions test. There were all sorts of things you had to do just to get into law school. Submit your transcripts like the old-fashioned way. You used to have to get official copies, all that stuff. And so ultimately, that's what I did. That's what I was doing towards the end of my college experience. And as it so happened, that college experience came to an end in the late 80s, and that was one of the biggest years for law school applicants. And unfortunately, I did not make it in those last few weeks before school started. I found out I just didn't quite make the cut at my last option.
And how many schools had you applied to at this first round of trying to get into law school?
I applied to 6 schools. That was the common wisdom, was you go to 6 schools, 2 that were quote unquote safe, schools that your numbers and tangible measurements meant you'd probably get in. 2 schools that were pretty close to your tangible measurements, and 2 schools that were, say, aspirational, like you'd hope to squeak into prestige.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the reach schools and then your standard ones. So
yes,
at this point, you get rejections from all 6. So you had your reach schools, you had your standard ones. What would you say the feelings were like at that point, and what was your perspective on your next step when you're seeing just nothing but rejection across the board?
Well, it was pretty devastating, because to take it a step back a bit, when I was in high school, I had grades that I will generously call mediocre and SAT scores that I will also generously call mediocre. And a lot of those people had told me that a 4-year university wasn't in the cards for me, let alone graduation and entering into law school. So when that rejection came years later, because I took several years off between high school graduation and finishing college, those voices started echoing back in my head. And I remember driving to work that night. I worked at a grocery store, wondering if they were right and if this is all my life was going to be, because I had been rejected and I had done, at least to my thinking, everything right. Mm-hmm. So I reached this point, I guess, this inflection point, this breaking point, where I realized that if I didn't do something, and if I just stood where I was at, I would not move forward. That's something I say in my book that's coming out in January, Defend Your Greatness, is that when you get knocked down, you know exactly where you are. Mm-hmm. You don't know where you're gonna go when you get back up. So when I got knocked down, I very easily could have stayed working at the grocery store, but something inside of me, my heart said, you've got to get away from all of this.
Mm-hmm. And for all the listeners, that's a really important point, because I know there might even be people listening to this show right now, hearing that and going, that's me. But like Kirk said, when you hit what we call a bottom, a rock bottom, you know exactly where you're at, and you have an opportunity to choose to do something different. And the fact that you're even listening to this show, to me, indicates that you want something different. So like Kirk, if you have something in your heart that's calling that there's something greater, there's something more out there, listen to that voice. And as we go through Kirk's journey, continue to listen about the things that he did that you could apply in your life. Because the power in these stories is seeing how someone who had hit rock bottom, who had hit a point where they thought, maybe these people are right, maybe the negative voices are right, when they saw the possibility on the other side and didn't just sit there and wait, they took action. So, Kirk, can you tell us about, you hit that point, you're not sure whether or not you can do this or what the next step is, or are those negative voices right? What was the next thing you did to take action to pull yourself out of that?
Well, I started really looking at what my realistic options were. And because my last rejection had come so close to the school year, I was basically limited in my choices of what I could do. And one of the things I could do was stay at the university that I was at and start fulfilling the prerequisites I would need in order to go to graduate school and earn a master's degree. Mm-hmm. So I basically packed up my 74 Super Beetle and went over. I was living in Washington at the time, in the Seattle area, and went over to the main campus of Central Washington University with the intention of earning a master's degree, with, again, the intention that that would make me a better candidate for law school a year or two down the road.
And this is always an interesting topic for me because I hear all different types of answers when it comes to master's degrees. And I know there's certain fields like medical, law, that where a master's makes more sense, or certain people say that it's a great way to elevate your career. Did you feel that getting a master's, now maybe as an isolated item itself, getting a master's, was that useful in and of itself? And then separately, was it also useful in helping you take that next step towards law school?
Well, I think ultimately it did help me, because ultimately I did get into law school. But mine was such a unique situation because the master's degree in and of itself was never the end game. Mm-hmm. It was the beginning. It was meant to advance me one step closer, so that when I went to law school, I said, hey, or when I applied to law school, rather, said, I've got a bachelor's degree, and now I've got this master's degree. So getting a master's degree on the resume, the academic resume, so to speak, was really my entire focus. So I had a very, very unique way of looking at obtaining a master's degree. It was a means to an end for me.
Yeah, in this case, it was a necessary next step on this path. It wasn't like, oh, it's just a fun thing to get. You were like, if I want to have the possibility of getting to my ultimate goal, I've got to do this thing.
But yeah, and it goes back to what you said earlier about following your heart and having that passion. To me, it was a means to fulfilling that passion. It wasn't a means to a job or anything else. It was fulfilling that passion that was inside of me. And if going to get a master's degree was the most logical step in that progression to get there, that was what I was going to do. And I think on a side note that's related to following your heart is the idea that when I went off, defied convention and just pitched my job and went off to graduate school, that's where I met my wife, and we've been married 25 years. So the payoff started immediately.
And I think that is a consistent theme, is that when we pursue the things that are in our heart, when we go for our passions, other things start to happen almost magically. And I'm sure from the way you talk about your wife, the marriage that you've had, the love that you guys share, if you had said, hey, I might not have gotten into law school, but if I'd known I was going to meet her, it'd almost be no doubt that, hell yes, I'm going to do it. Hell yes, I'm going to take the shot, because the relationships we have are what really enrich our life. And my opinion, that's what life is all about. So you had this pursuit. You took these steps to get towards the dream. And I'm curious, do you remember why you were initially drawn to law? What was it about law that made you want to pursue it with all this passion?
Well, I tell you, that goes back a long ways before graduation, and that is something that I talk about in my speeches and will write about in my book, is that I believe that each one of us has greatness inside of us. I use the analogy of a pea, so to speak, that sends out like a Wi-Fi signal to the universe. And at some point in time, more often than not, I think, before we reach that double-digit age range, that we connect with something that we want to do, that we have a passion about that we connect to it, and we really want to do it. More often than not, we are dissuaded from that path if it's unrealistic, unpractical, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And for me, there were a couple instances in my childhood. One was a connection with a book called She Wants to Be a Lawyer, and I didn't know why I was fascinated by it, but I was. And it was just a simple picture book talking about what a lawyer does every day and that sort of thing. And I was just like mesmerized by it. And of course that book, unlike books of adulthood that I read later on about getting into law school, didn't worry about the practical, didn't worry about what it took, how much it cost, what kind of education you had to have even to get there. It was just about what a lawyer did. And that and a false allegation of candy theft, I think, looking back when I was about 8 years old, that led me to, if I could psychoanalyze myself, that led me to a point where I was pretty passionate about becoming not only a lawyer, but a criminal defense lawyer.
So you wanted to be criminal defense so you could defend initially your first case being the great candy theft of whatever year it was. You wanted to make sure that you weren't busted. In my defense, Your Honor, it's your mom, dude.
Yeah.
So, all right. So you had this desire as a child, which I think is interesting. And for all the listeners, what can be a very interesting exercise is to go back to your childhood and look at the things that drew you in, that you were excited about as a child. And it's not necessarily to say, like, if you said, I want to be a skateboarder, that's what you were necessary, that had to be that one thing. There are aspects of that drew you in. And what are the aspects that you can bring into your life now? Because, Kirk, as you've talked about, it's like there's this clear goal, there's this mission, and on the way to the goal and the mission, there's changes, there's unexpected obstacles. So it's not necessarily about getting exactly there or there exactly when we expect. It's the lessons we learn as we go that help us get clarity on what we're really meant to do. So, Kirk, as you went off to law school, what was it like? Did it meet your expectations, or was it totally different being in law school? And what were some of the biggest lessons you learned during your time in law school?
Wow. That's a big question. I think law school was probably what I expected it to be. I mean, I knew it was going to be a lot of hard work. I went to law school in Laramie, Wyoming, which is a college town. Small town. I'd been married probably about 4 years at the time. So I was the married guy, so that made me a little different. And I was probably about 30, so I was a little older. Mm-hmm. And Laramie is very, very cold. But it really did beat my expectations. I was very engaged. I was still intent on becoming a criminal defense lawyer. I had some great experiences. I had the chance to argue twice in front of the Wyoming Supreme Court, not in any kind of student exercise, but as a practicing attorney with after your second year, you can do that. And I got the opportunity to run the Defender Aid Clinic, mm-hmm. which was an appellate clinic at the University of Wyoming. So I had this spectacular experience that was well suited as a springboard for my career as a criminal defense lawyer.
That's fantastic. And you said it was an appellate clinic. What is appellate?
Well, after someone is convicted, they have a right to appeal their conviction to a higher court, saying that the lower court's rulings were incorrect. And so at this clinic, we wrote appellate briefs seeking to have convictions overturned.
Gotcha. Okay, so appealing to existing convictions that were made. Got it. Okay, sweet. And so, all right, so it's meeting your expectations. You're in school, you're learning, you're having opportunities to do big things with law. And what were some of the biggest or primary lessons that came through the schooling before you got into the real world? What were the lessons that came through about maybe the legal procedure, things that you expected that were different in the legal system that surprised you? I'd be curious to hear some of the key takeaways from the actual educational portion of your time studying law.
Well, the educational portion was fascinating. I always tell people that want to go to law school, I say, great, go to law school, just don't practice law. But the logic and the development and the history of law is fascinating, and the correlation between laws and shifting societal morality is interesting as well. And I think the depth and complexity of it, of the practice of law, is interesting because it can often be black and white, but it can also be many shades of gray. And I think the other thing that I came out with, particularly with my experience with the appellate court and things of that nature, is the true gravity of the situation in a lot of criminal cases. I mean, we're talking about freedom lost, and maybe in some cases that's perfectly appropriate, and others it might not be. So the gravity and the severity of everything that a lawyer does is certainly imparted upon me as well.
Yeah, it's something that blows my mind, because I think about when I have a rough day in my day job, I'm like, well, it's not that big of a deal. A couple products don't get to where they need to be on time. But when it comes to law and the perception and how juries can misinterpret and how important it is for the lawyer to communicate, the limitations lawyers have, there's so many things that when it comes to, if I was ever in that situation, I want to know that I would have someone like you that is so passionate about it, that he's invested the time, the money, the energy, and he's built this repertoire of things that he can pull out. So as you wrapped up college, can you tell the listeners about what your first step was into the legal field once you left your college education at law school?
Sure. Well, I had the law degree, but I didn't have the license to practice law. What some of your listeners may know and some may not is that you have to take a bar exam in the state you want to practice law in order to be licensed. You have to pass the background check and other things, and depending on which state you're seeking admission in. So I had, prior to graduation, had discussed possibility of staying in Wyoming. I had a job offer in New Mexico, and I had the opportunity to interview in Maricopa County at the public defender's office, which is an indigent representation office where people go when they can't afford a lawyer. And I was very passionate about that as well, because I believe that people should have the opportunity to have top-notch legal services, whether they can afford it or not. Mm-hmm. I came down before graduation, the spring of 2000. My wife and I drove down from Wyoming, and we came to Phoenix, and I interviewed, and I received a position as a law clerk, which was a researching job, basically, that I could have until I passed the bar. And then when I passed the bar, I would be retained as a lawyer at the county public defender's office.
And how long did you spend working as a clerk doing the research before you ultimately passed the bar and were able to practice?
It was probably 10 to 12 months. I think we moved down in the summer. Yeah. And I was sworn in the next summer. So, about 10 months.
And for any of the listeners who are at a point where they're either studying for a certification for the bar or even just studying for exams while they're still in school, what are some of the recommendations you would have of things that helped you? Because to me, 10 to 12 months seems pretty quick, because from what I understand, the bar exams are extremely intense. What did you do to be able to study it quickly, and then succeed quickly at the goal? What would be some recommendations on how people can best prepare for the exams, these certification challenges in their life?
Well, I think you need to be motivated. And that sounds silly, and maybe that sounds like speak, but just, motivational speak, I guess. But, it's really true, because if you're passionate about what you want on the other side, then you're going to dedicate yourself to the task, and you're going to be more motivated to learn. To give an example, to be licensed in Arizona, I wanted to, as I said earlier, wanted to do criminal defense work. But there's no bar exam where you just take questions related to criminal defense. You have to bring in family law. You have to bring in torts. You have to bring in contract law. All kinds of stuff that I would never deal with in the real world in my 15-year career. But I had to have that motivation to learn that stuff at a deeper level enough to pass the bar. And that advice is really consistent, I think, with your question about people taking exams and things like that. The exam they might be taking, or the certification or whatever, might not be their ultimate goal. But if it's a stepping stone to that ultimate goal, the motivation towards that ultimate goal has got to be the reason you quash that test or that certification or whatever it may be.
Absolutely. It's something that I've found where I've been studying a lot of this recently about habit change, about how to create excitement about the task that you don't really feel naturally excited about. And to your point, it's what is it that you're working towards and how are you growing in this? And so for all the listeners, a great way to do this is rather than focus on the task itself, it's one, making it a game in terms of how can I do this faster? How can I learn more? How can I get this done in half the time? But also, if you're able to look at the challenge in front of you and link it to something you really want to do. So for me, if I have to build a bunch of Excel spreadsheets or answer a bunch of emails that I don't want to do, instead of focusing on that task that I don't want, you can focus, to Kirk's point, on what is something that I'm interested in. So rapid learning, or how can I make the process more efficient? How can I change things so that what used to take 3 hours takes an hour? So that it's no longer just, I have to do this monotonous task. I'm growing as I'm doing it and accomplishing the goal. So I love that, Kirk. It's such a critical thing to link what we're doing to larger causes and larger purposes. So you've linked these larger purposes, you're connected, you passed the bar. Can you tell the listeners about what it felt like when you were going into your first case as a practicing lawyer?
My first trial, I remember it was in an old courtroom. It was in a bigger courtroom, kind of grand kind of courtroom they don't make these days. And I remember standing up for the first time in my first trial. Unlike a lot of lawyers, it wasn't small business. The guy was going to prison if his trial, went south, so to speak. He was convicted. And I remember thinking, this kid needs a better lawyer. Because this was my first trial. This young man needs a better lawyer. And but that was it, and it lasted 3 or 4 days. It seemed like the biggest deal in the world to me. It was a much bigger deal to him. He was hyperventilating at the time that the verdict was read, but when he was acquitted, he was rather happy.
Which I imagine is a little bit of an understatement, because he's worried about. Like, do you know what the sentence or the potential was? Like, how long he could have been in prison if he had not been acquitted?
Oh boy, I'm going to guess it was in the ballpark of 5 years at minimum.
Wow, jeez, yeah, I can't imagine sitting there, because we all have those pivotal moments in our lives where we're waiting for that phone call, that email, or are we going to get the job offer, when people propose. But that's such a different experience than someone sitting up on this throne, essentially, and they're going to read off something that determines what the next 5, 10, 15 years, or maybe the rest of your life is going to look like. Those feelings are something I think we can't really imagine, and I don't think we would want to. But you got to see this over and over, and in that, do you know the number of how many cases that you worked over your 15-year career?
I honestly couldn't tell you. At the public defender's office, it was a high volume type of place, if you will. I certainly know it was a lot because I went to trial a lot. Most cases plead out, but I couldn't even venture a guess for you, Brian.
Okay. Now, what I would be curious about this too, before we go into some of the specifics of some of the bigger cases, is something we've talked about, and I've heard you speak about as well, that I think is very interesting, is we have this concept of people who are accused of something, and we tend to peg them a certain way. We say they're bad people, they're criminals, they're evil, they're dark, and you, unfortunately, in the work have seen a lot of dark, a lot of really terrible things, and seen a lot of the darker sides of humanity. But you also talked a lot to me about the humanity you saw in the individuals and how you started to realize that every one of these people is a person. Some people made mistakes. Some people were accused falsely. And those are things I don't think many of us can imagine what it's like to be put on trial for something you truly didn't do, and just trying to convince people of that. So can you share with the listeners, what were some of the things that you saw about these people, or that you learned about these people that most would deem as criminals, that we wouldn't necessarily anticipate, that we wouldn't expect or think, oh, that's how a criminal is, or that's the type of person a criminal is?
Well, it certainly varies a lot. I mean, you're right. Those being falsely accused of a crime and already being assumed guilty is one of the scariest things for a criminal defense lawyer. Those are the cases that keep you up at night. If the guy's guilty is on camera robbing a 7-Eleven, then that's not going to keep you up at night. Mm-hmm. If you feel like you have an innocent client, that's going to keep you up at night. But I think the biggest thing I would say is that there's always a story. We tend to put labels on people as a society in whole, not just criminal defendants, but certainly criminal is one of the strongest labels we can put on people. But we tend to put labels on people and not consider anything other than the label imposed, right? Mm-hmm. They're accused of doing this. They must have done it. They're a terrible person. And more often than not, when you open up the lens from that kind of myopic look, you know, you look all around and you look into the person, you see that there are so many more reasons why they are where they are. Now, a lot of people say, well, tough. I had a tough childhood and everything else, and I'm fine. And that may be true. But there's certainly a whole bunch of different ways to look at somebody's background, look at somebody's life, and find at least some degree of empathy in certain crimes. I mean, people are born brain damaged. People are born addicted to drugs. People have addictive personalities or addictive problems, and they do things they wouldn't otherwise do. Taking a look at that entire person is something that we should be doing not only with criminal defendants, but with everyone we meet.
Yes, it's so true, because I think it's a natural thing for our brain to try and do, because we want to be able to put people in buckets. We want to say who's good and bad. We want to be able to very quickly isolate and determine, like, these people are good, these people are bad, that's okay, that's not. But as you said, as we dig into stories, I think it was a Mr. Rogers quote where he said, I don't think there's a person on the planet you couldn't love if you heard enough of their story. And so often we have this single lens, this one bit of information, and we make rash or snap judgments. And I think that's so critical. So for all the listeners, this is something I need to hear today too, is thinking about the people that frustrate you in your life, not necessarily even criminals or these extreme cases. Think of the people who frustrate you or bother you, or you're like, why are they like that? It's a coworker, it's someone you see frequently, it's a family member. If you step back and go, where's the humanity in this person? What am I not seeing? What about their story have I not seen or asked or been told? And how can I provide some more empathy? Because then you're willing to get past the initial frustration and see the human being behind it. Because we've all got pain. We express it in different ways. Sometimes people get into legal trouble for it. Sometimes they don't. But as Kirk has done, and we all have the capacity to do, we can help and serve those people by not just deeming them or labeling them and accepting that label. So that's fantastic, Kirk.
And that also goes for the person in the mirror as well.
Ooh, good point.
Yes. Because, you know, when you were saying that, I thought about how many people that I met during the course of my career probably accepted the label of criminal, say, for example, and just thought that they weren't any better than that. And that is something that we all do to some degree, whether it's the label criminal or, you know, unworthy of a particular thing. I'm just the fat guy. I'm just whatever. I'm not meant to have that job. I'm not meant to have that relationship. We all bore those labels on ourselves. And when we, to my thinking, and something that I try to do out my legal career and certainly now in my life moving forward, is have a level of empathy for myself that allows me to have a level of empathy for others.
As soon as you said, let's apply that to the person in the mirror, I had this little shock in the heart, like, oh shit, let's not look at me. Let's just look at other people. And then it's one of those healthy moments of, oh shit, he's right. It's good. It's because that's one of the hardest things for me and many people to do, is be empathetic towards ourselves, to recognize the labels we're giving ourselves, the stories we're telling ourselves. And it's something that I've been reading a lot about recently, about the identities we choose, and recognizing that we can choose to change the labels we give ourselves, the identities we give ourselves, and that can lead to true change, because we often hold ourselves back or regress to bad habits because we haven't shifted the identity underneath. And that's true for criminals. That's true for people who do cereal diets and they always end up gaining weight back. It's about shifting and, like you said, having some empathy, some love for the person we see in the mirror, and saying, I am worthy of more. I deserve to treat myself better. I deserve to give myself a better life and work towards it and actually put in the time. So that's fantastic, Kirk. And it's such an important thing because I think in any job, people can get caught up in just treating the people or the things they're doing as just another number, and it's a thing I've got to do. But that empathy, I'm sure, has helped you. That I know it has helped you to help so many people in your career, and it's helped you help me and the people in our coaching program. So that's fantastic. Now, time is blowing by, so I want to make sure we continue into your story and get into what you're doing today. But I know there is one big step in your law career to talk about, because I know there were some huge lessons you learned from it. So there was one major case in particular that stood out in your career. Can you tell the listeners about what that case was and some of the things that you went through and learned about yourself by going through this?
Sure. To give a little more background, I guess I stayed with the Maricopa County Public Defender's Office in the regular unit, if you will, regular public defender for about 8 or 9 years. I had reached a point where I was ready for a change. I had a personal opposition to the death penalty. So I transferred to the death penalty unit of that office. And that is a group of lawyers that works exclusively on death penalty cases, has one or two. They're very intense cases and require a lot of work and long trials. And it was in my capacity then, back in 2009, that I was assigned to represent somebody who's now probably one of the most infamous women in the world, Jodi Arias. I was assigned as her lead counsel as the state was seeking to impose death upon her. Now, you asked me what I learned from this experience, and I could probably go on for a couple hours but you know, I certainly had an experience that I never thought I would have. You know, it is certainly one of those things where things seemed illogical. For example, I was ordered by the court to keep the case after I was leaving the public defender's office, which was uncommon practice, and I respect the judge's ruling, but it was uncommon practice. Everything had me to the point where I was to serve as counsel for this woman. And life was pretty normal until January 2nd, 2013, when the day that the trial started. And for those unfamiliar, she was accused of murdering her boyfriend. They had had sex and documented their sexual activity with pictures at about 1:30 in the afternoon. And about 5:30 in the afternoon, his body had been stabbed 27 times, his throat was slit, and he had a gunshot to the face. And there was blood everywhere in the upper area of his house, bedroom and bathroom, is where this occurred in his house in Mesa. The trial became what I would call a reality TV sensation. It was live streamed across the world over the internet. It was huge ratings for networks like CNN and HLN that covered those trials, covered them wall to wall. People would wait out in line till about 4 a.m, trying to get tickets for the next day. People would alter their vacation plans. I became a public figure, a recognizable public figure, someone who, you know, could not escape the spotlight. Back then I was a lot heavier than I am now and had a shaved head. I was pretty easy to recognize. And as the trial went on over the 6 months of the trial, it probably got to a point where I was on TV close to 24 hours a day.
Wow. And this is something where I know a lot of people think they want fame and they want to be recognized and they want to be on TV. But I know that in this case, when it being a gruesome murder trial, and the fact that you had spent the time working on death row, you had seen intense, heavy things. And one of the things I'm always curious about, and I think is something very valuable you've shared with me about what it was like going through this. But I also, before we get to that, can you tell the listeners a bit more about what happened outside the courtroom? Because the things you told me about what you started to receive and things you started to hear really blew my mind, because I thought he's just a lawyer. Why would they be doing these things to him? But if you could tell them a bit about that, it's truly mind-blowing stuff.
Yeah, I mean, along with the fame really came infamy and a lot of hatred. A lot of people tied the sins of the client to the lawyer. The entire defense team, I wasn't immune to this, would receive constant death threats, be it over social media or letters I would receive. There would be numerous calls to my office threatening me or my wife. She quit her job so she could be at home, be a little more safer. I had security around me whenever I walked into the courthouse. Cars were checked for bombs. There was all sorts of hypervigilance on my part, I guess, because people were so adamant and so angry about the case and had been worked up about the case and probably didn't understand the entirety of the reasons why I was there. And so, yeah, there were lots of threats made and a lot of derogatory things said about me and a derogatory image advanced to the world.
Yeah. And for those people who didn't understand the full story or the why behind why you were doing what you're doing, what would you say to them if you had an opportunity to speak to them and explain the reason behind why you were defending this woman and doing this work? What would you say?
Well, I would begin with saying that I offer no excuses or no apologies because I'm an ardent believer in the Sixth Amendment and everybody has the right to a free trial. Mm-hmm. But what I would begin to say in a more broad scope is that instead of simply attacking or bashing things we are down on, to try to use that empathy, to look through it with that empathetic lens. You know, I know death threats now are probably commonplace on social media, right? We've Miss Ford, one of Judge Kavanaugh's accusers, I understand, is still getting death threats and can't go back to work and things like that. And whatever side of the political spectrum you fall on, I don't think most well-thinking human beings believe that that's appropriate. Mm-hmm. So, point of it being is to look with some empathy, some understanding, and maybe the fact that you don't know all the facts might be a reason for you to withhold judgment. You know, and a perfect example of that is in July of this past year, I did a show called In Defense Of. And In Defense Of was a documentary, and it there were 4 episodes, myself and 3 other attorneys. We each had an hour documentary about our cases, our infamous cases. And the most common response I got is that I'm sorry I didn't understand. I'm sorry that I had ill feelings towards you. I didn't understand. And which I'm perfectly fine with, but I think that when we have these aggressive impulses towards anybody, whether it's, you know, me because I'm representing someone you don't like, or the guy who cut you off on the freeway, or the guy who wouldn't, you know, cut in front of you at the line at the grocery store or whatever, maybe having some empathy and not judging and not getting angry is a better way to go than judging without full understanding.
Yeah. It's so important to realize, because especially in the social media age, we see a headline, we see a bullet point, we see a meme, and we think we have an understanding of what's going on with that person or that complex situation. It's so easy to just pass judgment and go, oh, well, this is it, and I know that because I heard this from someone. But to what you said, to be able to step back and look at it and go, I don't know all the details, and I'm not going to start judging, and I'm not going to start attacking or placing blame or pointing fingers, and not just until I have the details. It's like that never leads to growth, and that never leads to a deeper level of understanding when we're just attacking. It takes that openness, that empathy, and that curiosity you're discussing in order to have the opportunity for that to even be able to come about. So before we move on to the next step of your life, because this was such a massive thing and such an intense time in your life, because I can't even fathom dealing with that level of intensity, of that much pressure, attention, all these eyes looking at you. What were the things that you did either then or that you've done over time to help get through the stress and help work through the pressure, the anxiety, the fear, to be able to get through? Because I think that's a level of intensity most people can't imagine, and the insights that you have about how to work through it are invaluable in this.
Well, one of the things, I guess, and this kind of goes back to your question about what are the lessons I learned through this process. And I learned that we can accomplish great things if we have a resolve to do so, and it's within our passion. And while my experience is unique, I consider it to be on the macro level of what we all experience every day. We all probably feel scrutinized to some level. We all feel stressed to some level. We all feel pressure to some level. And so the point of that being is that understanding that we don't have to seek external validation from, even if it's on a worldwide basis or your neighbor down the hall. I think relieving that need for external validation is a huge stress reliever, because there's a lot of energetic, just a lot of energy that can be spent tied up in trying to please others and worrying about what others are thinking of you, instead of following the beat of your own drum and knowing what you are doing is right. It's not as much different now that, we talk about it, than it was when I left the grocery store to go to law school, because in my heart I felt like it was right. And that's what I needed to do. And once I was ordered to represent in these areas, to my thinking, she was going to get the best representation she could. And on a personal level, I didn't believe that she was worthy of the death penalty, and there's lots of reasons for that that aren't really relevant. But that resolve was also comforting to me. Mm-hmm. That and just what I consider simple things. I did my best, believe it or not, even though I was grossly overweight at the time. I did my best to exercise and meditate almost on a daily basis.
It's amazing how small things like that can make a huge difference when we have daily practices that we implement in our lives that enable us to have some level of positivity, even when we're in the really dark times. But also, I think it speaks so much to your character, Kirk, to talk about, like, you were faced with and assigned to defend this woman, and you said, this is my job, and I'm going to do the best job I can. I'm not going to make assumptions. You practiced what you preached and said, I'm going to hear the full story, and I'm going to work to do the best work I can. And I also believe it says a lot about you, too, the idea where you had this resolve, you had this idea, and you're like, I'm going to make these things happen in terms of the dreams, in terms of the way that you work to protect people. That says so much. So for all the listeners, think about the things in your life that drive or evoke so much emotion and intensity that it pulls you forward to do your greatest work and not accept anything less than your best. Those are the things that really are what I believe we should be striving for, because the things that bring out the best in us allow us to serve at our highest level. So, Kirk, in the next step of your story, and when you ultimately decided that it was time to leave your career in law, I know you had another massive challenge coming your way. So can you tell the listeners about what the transition out of law looked like and what that unexpected challenge was that came your way?
Sure. So for those not familiar, just getting back to the Arias matter, she was finally sentenced. There were two trials. She was not done. I was not done with her as her lawyer until April 2015. And April 2015 was the first time since I began practicing law in 2001 that on a professional level I had nothing to do. I had no meetings, no appointments, nothing. And I was going for a jog on a nice April day here in Phoenix, and just kind of thinking, okay, what am I going to do? Well, I had, busy work at the office, but that was about it. And I started having this feeling in my heart, ultimately, that I didn't want to go back to practicing law anymore, that I was kind of done. And it didn't sit well, right? We've talked a little bit about my story and the rejection and going to master's degree, all this stuff I did to get to law school. And in some ways I was at the top of my game because I was nationally known. In other ways I was in the complete toilet, so to speak, because my name had been maligned so much. But there I was, and I had all these messages from major networks wanting interviews and blah, blah, blah. And a lot of things that other lawyers would be maybe dying for. And for me, I just wanted to go on my run, and I didn't want these feelings of not wanting to practice law. So basically, as time went on, it didn't return. I intellectualized it as burnout. And I decided which was a pretty good intellectualization, because I've been working 12, 14 hours a day for years.
Wow.
Trying to save this woman's life. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to take the summer off. It's excruciatingly hot in Phoenix, as you've experienced. And I'm going to do some bucket list type trips with my wife. And then in September, when it starts to cool down, I'm going to go back and fire up the law practice, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And it was in late August of 2015, mid to late August of 2015, we were about ready to take our last trip to Seattle, that I discovered that my lymph node under my armpit was inflamed. And that led to an appointment with my doctor, that led to an extraction, that led to stage 3 non-Hodgkin's lymphoma diagnosis. So from, within the period of 3-4 months, I had this professionally and personally devastating trial. And then when I went back towards the practice of law, cancer came into my life.
And it's something where it seems like at these points in our life, it's one thing after another. There can be these moments, or these, not just moments, but these periods of time in our lives where it's one thing after another. It's the biggest challenge you've ever faced. There's all this national pressure, there's local pressure, there's all this attention, and then now you have stage 3 non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. It's almost like, when are the hits going to stop? It's almost one of those moments where you look up at God, like, what is it I'm meant to learn here? Why does this keep happening? So with those feelings, I know there can be times where we get lost in either just focusing on the problem, but I know you looked at ways to create a solution. So what was it that you did to help get through your battle with cancer?
Well, once I found out I had stage 3 and that it was going to require 6 rounds of chemotherapy, surgeries, and all the associated things, I really kind of went to a dark place, but it was a dark place that I needed to go. I really gave serious contemplation to not undergoing chemotherapy, to let cancer take me out. I mean, I was 49 years old. I was, wondering if I wanted to practice law. I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I was just really thinking, should this be my time to leave? And when I went to that dark place, I started realizing that if I was going to go through chemotherapy, I needed to find reasons not to die, but to live. And so what I did was really take inventory of my life and think about reasons to live. And not for anybody else, not for my wife, not for friends or family, reasons for me to live. And when I connected with those reasons, that motivated me. That and a promise to myself that if I had more time on the planet, because I realized in this process that I really wasn't fighting for my life, I was fighting for more time on the planet, that if I was going to fight for more time on the planet, that I was not going to live my remaining days the way I had lived the first 49 years of my life. And even though I didn't know what that was in terms of a purpose or the effect I was going to have on people or anything else, I just made that leap towards chemotherapy with the idea that eventually that passion, that mission would reveal itself to me.
That's beautiful, man. And when you were taking that inventory, what were some of the things for you that were the reasons for you to live? Because I know there are people listening right now that are going like, I'm trying to find my reason or my reasons for living, and maybe they're trying to associate it with someone else, or they're trying to live somebody else's dream. What was it that really stood out for you that made you go, life is worth living, and I'm going to fight to create more time so I can bring more value to the planet?
I don't know that it was any one thing tangible, although I had this overarching feeling that I had something more to do. Just a general overarching feeling and a faith that there was something else more for me to do. Because it wasn't about, watching sports on TV or whatever, who wins the next World Series. That wasn't what life was going to be about, or not making my wife a widow. It was about really enjoying my life, making happiness a beacon, which was a big thing, a big shift for me. And just that simple idea of just that feeling that I had a purpose beyond my current circumstances, which is what I felt when I got rejected for law school. And I think your listeners out there should know that their current circumstance, whatever it is, good or bad, is temporary. And there's more that lies beyond that current circumstance.
I love that, because what I love about that is so often we're told we need to find our passion or find our purpose. And in this case, you didn't need to know exactly what it was or exactly what you're going to do, but you had this feeling deep inside yourself that there was something greater out there. There's something in the world you were meant to bring, create, do. And just that feeling was what you used to drive you through this battle. And that's so powerful. For all the listeners, keep in mind, this is a journey of exploration and discovery. It's not just about knowing this one thing and doing that one thing. If you have that feeling in your heart, there's something you're called to do. That's fantastic. If you're not feeling that feeling, you can invigorate it and engage it by going and exploring more in life. So, Kirk, can you tell the listeners about what the next steps in your life looked like when you made that mental shift, you dove into the battle against cancer? What did the next steps in life look like?
Well, I think the next step really became an examination of life just more in general. And what I referenced a minute ago was really shifting the beacon of my life to that sort of material success, status, whatever you want to call it, all that comes with being a lawyer, to happiness. Mm-hmm. And I inventoried my life in the sense that, and I asked myself the question, are you happy? And to say I asked myself that question is probably a bit of a misstatement. I really confronted myself with that question, because it's so easy to say, am I happy? And you say yes, because that doesn't require change. But if you confront yourself with the question and really look at it and really start breaking down the aspects of your life. For example, me, I used the three big ones. I looked at my personal life. I looked at my professional life, and looked at my marriage, and the friends and everything else, and the marriage was great. And I wanted a yes answer to the was I happy with my career, but I could never get there. Mm-hmm. Now, I could have lied to myself. And that's why I say confront. I could have lied to myself, because that would have meant no change. But I really realized, and it was tough, given the road to get there, and the road while I was in law school and everything else, to really say, no, I'm not. Mm-hmm. And I have kept, in whatever I do, that mindset shift, because we can change our careers, we can change all sorts of things, but if the underlying thinking doesn't change, then we don't really change, and we get back to the same place. So the mindset shift for me was, I'm going to use happiness as a beacon instead of worrying about what my W-2 says at the end of the year.
Well, I love the idea of confronting yourself with a question, because like you said, it takes that more active role and that ownership of Hey, are you really where you want to be? Is this really making you happy? You're just saying that because of, like you said, the material success or the other things, or that's what other people might want. And having that ability to be able to have the honest conversations with yourself in life opens you up to the possibility of actually shifting and making the changes you need to become truly happy. So what were some of those shifts that you needed to make? And we heard career was one of them. What were some of the shifts you needed to make to move away from the things that were not building your life into that beacon of happiness that you wanted to be and also move towards?
Well, I think it was really realizing what made me happy. More often than not, and this is true of young and old, we make our decisions about the course we're going to chart in life, especially, in college, we're 19 or 20, we pick our major, and all of a sudden we become an accounting major, and all of a sudden we're an accountant. And we have these things, and we have a mortgage, and we have a car, and whatever it is. I started really looking at what made me happy. What did I like to do? What was of real value to me? I've heard this expression. I wish I could remember who said it. Is if you don't sell something, you buy it every day. And what was I buying? What was I doing? Were these things really bringing me joy, or were they just, temporary hits on the joy pipe as opposed to real sustainful happiness, right? Because we can go out and buy a nice car and say, look at this, and this makes you happy for a couple of weeks or 6 months, and then all of a sudden it's just your car. And so starting to really take a look at what really made me happy in life, and what would be a joyful way to spend my time. And in another interview, I came up with the idea that I used the term joyful urgency. I started realizing that my time on this planet was limited. Now, we all know that, but most of us try to forget it. And realizing that my time was limited and that I wanted to have fun while I was here and have an impact while I was here. With that beacon of happiness, and focusing my energy on the things that made me happy. Doing more of what made me happy as opposed to working to buy a bigger car or a fancier house or what have you.
Mm-hmm. I have never heard the term joyful urgency, and that is magical because it captures the idea of working towards things and knowing that life isn't promised, it isn't guaranteed, and we shouldn't wait, but it's doing it. It's the whole concept of enjoying the ride and enjoying the journey as we go. So having this joyful, urgent journey and being present in the moment, all those things come together in that phrase. So I love that. All right, everyone, that wraps up part 1 of my interview with Kirk Nurmi. In our second interview, we go so much deeper into the work that he is doing, how he's working to make an impact, what he's working to share with the world. And the reason I wanted to do a 2-parter was I talked with him after this first one. I said, listen, man, I don't want to shortchange all the amazing work that you're doing, how you're expanding and growing and challenging yourself. You're doing things that are both exciting and scary. I wanted to be able to really dive in. So we broke this up into a 2-parter, and you'll be hearing that episode next. So the next interview that comes out for OCG will be part 2 with Kirk Nurmi. Now, before we wrap up for today, I just want to highlight a few of my favorite points from today's episode. Now, make happiness a beacon. I think it's so easy to get distracted by what we think we're supposed to do and what we're supposed to experience. I know for me, this happens all the time where I'm like, well, no, I'm not supposed to be happy now. I'm supposed to be working hard, and then I'll make more money, or I'll get more downloads, or I'll have more attention from dating partners or whatever it may be, and then I will be happy. But in order to make happiness a beacon, I think it's something that we need to be experiencing. Now, we have to be focused on it now. We have to see it in our reality and create it. And what I've found is that happiness is not a result of achieving more most of the time. The basic happiness, the simple, beautiful happiness that can be quite profound, comes just from living a life that excites and it inspires us. It's when we do those things that we really want to do. It's when we step out of our comfort zone. It's when we finally have the courage to have that conversation with that person at work or ask our boss for the promotion. It's when we live with joyful urgency, which is another one of my favorites, that we say, I'm going to find joy now. I'm going to create and find joy and happiness. I'm going to celebrate and find all the different reasons in my life to be grateful. But I'm also going to create some movement, some purpose, some intention, and move with urgency. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to move fast. You have to push, 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 push. Sometimes it just means you're willing to say, I know I'm tired. I know it's been a long day at work, but I want to get this message out. And you know, right now, guys, is a perfect example. I love talking to Kirk. He's a person that has helped me in more ways than he knows. And we've had some just phenomenal conversations together. And I'm exhausted. It's been a long day. And I was like, maybe I can just put it off another day. But I'm like, the sooner I get this recorded and edited and up, the sooner people can benefit from Kirk's message in the way I have. And a bunch of ways I haven't. Like, that's the beauty of these messages. They have so much potential to impact, but they only get out there if we put them out there. So the same is true for you. And if you're having trouble with that, confront yourself with a question. I love this phrasing. I love the way he put it, because when we're confronting ourselves with a question, we're not asking the easy, simple softball questions that we would be more inclined to ask when we're trying to stay comfortable. When we confront ourselves with a question, we don't go, what do I want to watch on Netflix? We go, why haven't I started working out yet? Why haven't I started researching how to start a YouTube channel? Why haven't I started learning how to cook so I can actually prep good, healthy food for myself? Is looking in the mirror and saying, listen, man, you deserve better than this. And let's do something about it. So make happiness a beacon. Confront yourself with the difficult questions so that you can then live with joyful urgency. So this is going to wrap it up for today, guys. Be sure to check out Kirk's website, both in the show notes, or you can type in unchainedlives.com. That's unchainedlives.com. And also go to Amazon and you can buy Kirk's book, Defend Your Greatness. That's his latest book because he's got several. So thank you all for listening today. Thank you for being a part of the show. I love having you all here. I love sharing these messages with you. And get ready, because in part 2, we dive even deeper into Kirk's story, and he shares so much more magic with us. So get ready, buckle up. I love you guys, and I'll be talking to you again real soon.